Hello, and my name is Pete Rushmer, and I'm your host today of A Half Dozen Things podcast. A Half Dozen Things is a podcast for business owners just like you. Whether you're an underdog hungry for success, or you're already smashing it but want to continue to level up, we are here each week for you to get insight and learning from the very best in the business. No fluff, no BS, and no self-proclaimed gurus talking about how easy business or life is.
As we always say on the introduction to these podcasts now, the red light is rolling. So welcome to Half a Dozen Things. My name's Mike Vickers and I'm the host and I'm both the interviewer and the interviewee today on this special Half a Dozen Things broadcast. You may notice the absence of Pete. Pete has allowed me a free rein to do a special, and I can call it a special because Pete's not here to tell me off. So it is a Half a Dozen Things special, and I'm your host, Mike Vickers, and I'm a part of the team at Flagship. And you may recognise my voice, or I've got a great voice for radio, of course. You may have noticed that on our Fleet Geeks podcast. So I'm one of the fleets in the Fleet Geek. So Pete's asked me along today to talk about a subject that I think is very close to everybody's heart in the fleet world. We in particular, it's a bit cliched. I don't want to come across as being too cliched here, but we at Flagship Partners, we do pride ourselves on how close we are to road safety and how close it is to our hearts. It's what kind of drives us on. I think we all share. That's one of the values that we all share. So when it comes to looking after people on the road who may be more vulnerable than we are in big trucks and buses and things, and I think it's only natural. I think to me, it's a very natural thing to want to look after somebody who's slightly more vulnerable. And I think we're all like that. If we were digging deep enough, we're all like that in terms of looking after those people that are in a more vulnerable position than we are. So when we translate that to the way we use the highways, it is no surprise to me. Many of you will have heard the news or have seen articles. In fact, we've done podcasts on it ourselves about the recent changes to the highway code, which brought in this hierarchy of road users. Now, to me, there was nothing really very shocking in that at all, because isn't that what we've always done? We've always looked after the vehicle or the type of road user that is more vulnerable than we are. So it's not really, for me, it wasn't really a major sea change, but clearly it is, and clearly it's talked about a lot in the industry. And it's a psychological change from way we previously thought about things when it comes to operating heavy goods vehicles or a bit larger vehicles, vans included, even cars, on our streets of our towns and cities. So that's what I'm going to talk about, vulnerable road users today. And in true Half a Dozen Things fashion, I've picked out 6 areas I think that fleets should be looking at when it comes to what they can do to promote the safety of those vulnerable road users, and how that will translate to the drivers. Because at the end of the day, it's not just about protecting the vulnerable road user. It's you don't need to be a genius to work out if, for example, a truck and a cycle come together, or if a truck and a pedestrian come together. There's only really going to be one winner, but in fact, we're all losers. I've seen firsthand the devastating consequences of a driver of vehicles and drivers and operators that have been involved with a serious accident or fatality, even involving vulnerable road users. So we're all losers, and in some ways, you have to choose your words carefully here, so as not to upset or offend. But in all circumstances, nobody sets out in the morning, unless you want to commit an act of murder and it's premeditated. Nobody sets out in the morning in a truck to kill somebody or end up with somebody dead. So without offending or upsetting people, we're all victims. They're all victims. It's not just the person whose life has been lost or seriously injured. It's also the person that has to live and the people. And one of the things I always make sure that it's an interesting little piece of data that I picked up a little while ago. I'm not sure where it came from. I have to be honest, but it doesn't really matter, because you can absolutely see it, that a fatal road traffic collision affects 500 people, and we call it the tip of the iceberg, isn't it? So the occasion of a very serious or fatal road traffic collision, it's sadly it's part and parcel of everyday life, and we see the aftermath on the roads, and the emergency services come along and they do a fantastic job of looking after the people and investigating and clearing, making the roads safe again. So we see that, and then it's gone. The next day, it's and sadly it's yesterday's news. But for some people, it's not yesterday's news. It's a lifetime of loss, pain, and anguish. And that you've also got to consider the other people that are affected: friends, family, colleagues. The emergency services, the coroner's courts, the magistrates' courts, all of these people that come into contact with that fatal road traffic collision. And the estimate is that that's up to 500 people every single time that happens. So it is a very, very important subject. So as I say, in true half a dozen things fashion, then let me crack on with my number one. My number one message for fleets in terms of their vulnerable road users is identify your risk. Look at vulnerable road users as any other risk assessment. It's a hazard. It's got the potential to cause harm. Not saying the vulnerable road users themselves are going to cause harm, but the occasion of driving into a town or a city, or even around the rural roads, and coming into conflict with a vulnerable road user has that potential to cause harm. So look at it like any other risk assessment. Look at your exposure as a fleet to vulnerable road users, and then look at the risks. What's the likelihood and consequences of coming into contact with vulnerable road users? So and I think also, whilst these schemes are extremely good in they work in fairly different ways, but if you're a fleet that is primarily involved, you're delivering into London, so your vehicles are all DVS compliant, etc. You may be FORS registered, you may even be clocks operators, recognised operators. You might be operating to what you believe is a really high standard, but don't just rely on those standards alone as standalones to try to risk assess your interaction with vulnerable road users. So have a look at the risks that you expose your drivers to and your vehicles to on a day-to-day basis when it comes to vulnerable road users, and like any other risk assessment, try to manage that risk to the lowest practical level, which is something we love saying, don't we, in this world. So identify your risks is number one. Number two, do you have a policy when it comes to vulnerable road users? Now, we've got policies for all sorts of things in our business, haven't we? In our industry, we look for policies for practically everything. And why shouldn't we have a policy for vulnerable road users? Now, you might say, well, okay, what does a policy look like for vulnerable road users? We could start off by looking at what's your policy regarding, having done your risk assessment, what's your policy regarding, let's say, for example, vehicle specification. Do you have a standard one-size-fits-all vehicle specification? So every time you order a new vehicle, buy a second-hand vehicle, do you fit cameras? What's the process for fitting cameras, audible warnings, and that type of thing? So that's where you can start your policy off. In terms of the hardware. Look at when you're looking at any policy, in our world, you look at the driver. So look at the driver. Look at we'll talk about training in a minute, but look at how you would set up a driver in terms of coming into your operation and making them aware of those risks that you've identified with vulnerable road users. So how do we make a policy for the driver, policy for the vehicle, how to make the vehicle safe or safer, cameras, auditable one is whatever it might be that you choose to go down, and then look at the environment that you're operating in terms of what's the mix and how do you sort of sort out what your urban, interurban, that kind of journeys are. So look at putting that together in a form of a policy that everybody can, it goes up. Policies go upwards. I've always believed policies go upwards as well as downwards. So you've got to get everybody in the business, right from the managing director, right, for want of a better word, I'm not going to say down to the drivers, because obviously anything, that drivers are obviously at the top of the tree. They always have been, of any business, or at least they should be. But you know what I'm saying. You have to have it across the whole of the business. So number one, identify your risks. Number two, draw up a policy or outline a policy for your vulnerable road users. How you're going to tackle those risks. Then think the third one, probably from my point of view as a trainer, would be the awareness for drivers, without a shadow of a doubt. Awareness of vulnerable road users. So vulnerable road users, before we even go anywhere else with vulnerable road users, we need to know who they are and why they're vulnerable. What makes them vulnerable. Let's look at life through somebody else's eyes and in somebody else's shoes. What makes somebody want to get on a push bike and cycle, 6-7 miles into work every day, in all weathers, pouring rain, etc., etc. Why aren't people who are walking around the high street and crossing roads, why aren't they focused on crossing the roads? Why aren't they, why are they staring at the phone screen, etc., etc.? So we have to understand why they're vulnerable and what makes them vulnerable. That if we look at life in general through our own eyes, we never get a clear picture, do we, of what other people's motivations are. So making people aware that, number one, who the vulnerable road users are. We can pick up the obvious bunches there. We've got to be very, very careful with drivers, because when we do driver training with vulnerable road users, they tend to sort of think, well, this is another course about cyclists. Well, actually, I looked in some interesting statistics earlier and I'm just going to look at my notes because I can't remember these things off the top of my head. But in 2016, in terms of accidents involving heavy goods vehicles, in 2016, out of the 463 fatalities throughout that year involving vulnerable road users and heavy goods vehicles, 40% of those 463, I'm not even going to attempt to do the maths, but I suppose a bit over 200, isn't it? 40% of those were actually pedestrians. So, they are in the most vulnerable group when it comes to heavy goods vehicles. And that is almost, always pedestrians hit, while they're crossing the road. So, and drivers, and that generally is with blind spots, with vehicles being tall and high, people crawl under, people sneak underneath the driver's vision. Hence, we've had, since 2012, we've had the various mirrors that are now standard on heavy goods vehicles. So 40% were pedestrians, 38% motorcyclists, and 21% of pedal cyclists. So, don't just automatically assume that a vulnerable road user is a cyclist. Yes, they are in a very vulnerable group. And quite often the headlines are between a cyclist and a HGV. That tends to be what most people think. If we were playing word association, you'd say, vulnerable road user, heavy goods vehicle, the next word out your mouth will be cyclist. Well, it clearly isn't. We've got to look at other vulnerable road users as well. So, in terms of awareness for drivers, identify them, why they're vulnerable, try to, see things from their point of view, and then sort of build that, what awareness into actual actions that we can take, or tools in our sort of driving armory that we can build into our everyday lives everyday driving lives to help us avoid that conflict with between heavy goods vehicles and vulnerable road users. Now, I referred to earlier the hierarchy of road users. So, that kind of, for me, is just formalised, I think, certainly for myself, always sort of thought. But the hierarchy of road users sort of looks at
Hi, it's Pete from Flagship Partners. We're proud to sponsor a Half Dozen Things podcast. Flagship Partners help their clients become safer, greener and greater through a range of consultancy and training services. We offer audits through to risk assessments, contracts through to support with managing your culture, all the way from mandatory training through to management training as well. So if you need any support, please do get in touch with Flagship Partners today.
The responsibility being on the vehicles that can do the most harm. And so where that practically has made a difference is, I think the most contentious change to the highway code was this notion that if we're turning into a side street from a main road, that we give way to pedestrians already crossing the road. So, what else are we going to do? Run them over then, or what do we used to do? I kind of think that most good drivers, most aware drivers, will have already been doing something very, very similar to that themselves. So, I think the awareness comes down to the way they drive, the methods that they deploy when they're in the cities and towns where you're likely to come across a high concentration of vulnerable road users. There is a video that we use on a training course, and it's quite a famous internet clip. It's become famous over the years, and it involves a sort of cyclist head cam footage of a coming together between a HGV and a cyclist, and it's on a place called Chain Walk, which is sort of on the Chelsea sort of side of the embankment in London, and it's a great video because it's for people to. We've got to be careful we don't just look purely at blame in terms of liability, but what I get the delegates to do is have a look at this incident and look at it from lots and lots of different angles, not physical angle, but look at it from lots of different viewpoints. Not trying to portion blame, but what went wrong? Why did this cycle? Now, it's not a horror movie. I'll come to that in a minute. When it comes to talking to drivers about vulnerable road users, it's not a horror movie. It actually ends up reasonably well. The HGV, and it's a 13.6 meter trailer Arctic. It kisses the cyclist, and literally the cyclist has a bit of a wobble, and then there's an altercation between the cyclist and the driver. But essentially, no one's injured. I want that guy's lottery number though that day, because he probably, if you ever see the footage, he's the luckiest guy in the world. But the purpose of that footage is to say, not to try to apportion to blame, but to try to get drivers, the delegates in the room, to think about what went wrong, what could we have done, what is there potentially that is at play there. And I think I've done this course many times, and I think I only once, and it wasn't so long ago. The guy that gets out the cab, essentially, this is because, say, it's in the embankment in London. The guy that gets out the cab is clearly not a local, clearly not a Londoner, clearly not even, his accent is very, very Midlands. All right. I'm sorry if I've offended anybody from the Midlands there. Doing my little bit of all right. And it clearly. So remember, one delegate said, "I think I know what part of the problem could be there." And this, spoiler alert, if you ever come on the course and see it. And this guy said, "The guy's not local, is he? How often does he drive in London?" Anybody, this guy who was on the course was clearly a Londoner, and he said, we all know that we can predict what cyclists are going to do because we're about with them all day, every day. And this guy will probably, who knows? That could have been his first. He clearly was an experienced driver. That's I'm not saying the guy was a novice or anything, but how many times has he driven in London, and how often is he exposed to that? And that was just an interesting thought. If that guy would have been more aware of vulnerable road users and why they do what they do and why they are what they are, that incident may have been prevented. So again, without trying to turn this into a sales pitch, as it were. Vulnerable road users, great driver CPC course. It's obviously, I think, lots and lots of driver CPC courses add value. I'm a big proponent of driver CPC courses, but that one in particular could save somebody's life, and it could save somebody's life, and it could also save somebody's from a life of anguish and hassle and all the rest of it. So great course, and I thoroughly recommend. Even if you don't, which I can't think why you wouldn't, but if you don't choose Flagship Partners for that, it's definitely a course that is well worth doing. But ours is really, really good. I'm going to say that, aren't I? Right, positive messaging then. I mentioned it, alluded to it a little while ago. Positive messaging. It's very, very tempting to say to drivers, right, vulnerable road users, driver bad, vulnerable road users good, and driver bad, you're going to end up in prison, you're going to end up with a big fine, and the world's going to be a terrible, terrible place. I think I know there's a bit of a sea change in health and safety training these days. I mean, once upon a time, health and safety training was simply you sat down, you watched a load of videos about people getting squished and squashed and falling off ladders and getting electrocuted, and it was like a horror show. And the idea was that would shock you, no pun intended, that would shock you into not doing what the poor person on the video was doing. So I think we've got to change that. I think we've got to change the messaging when it comes to vulnerable road users. We'll start talking positively instead of negatively. How to avoid those kind of outcomes, not threatening people. I think that sort of notion about this. If you don't do this, you will end up in prison. And if you do that, I think we've just got to be more positive with the messaging, very careful how we put this across. Don't just sort of just go out all guns blazing and say, driver bad, vulnerable road users good. It's all your fault. And this is what's going to happen to you if you don't do it right. Let's be more positive than that and prevent that happening. However, coming on to number 5 then. Number 5 is to ensure as a fleet or as a fleet manager, transport manager, that you do investigate accidents and incidents in the correct manner, and really try to get the bottom on. If incidentally, the without sounding like we're cutting corners here, that same video I also use in another course, which is accident investigation for managers. Because it's great to see if there's a different approach between when we show it to drivers and when we show it to transport managers. Do they view that incident any differently? So accident investigation for me is a huge area where we've got an opportunity. As transport managers, are busy people, and we tend to look at accidents and incidents in terms of liability, in terms of what your insurance company has agreed to accept or deny liability for. And I think we need to look at accidents in a far wider round than that. It's not just about liability from a financial point of view. I think an insurance companies being insurance companies will tend to be pragmatic in terms of their liability approach. Despite what people might think of insurance companies, I think it comes to the pragmatic side of things. And just because an insurance company accepts liability doesn't necessarily mean that the blame lies in there. There might be many causes of that accident or incident. It's just more pragmatic for the insurance company to accept liability or to go down the path of knock for knock kind of thing, because it's just easier to work through. So as transport managers, don't just go for they've accepted liability, so their driver's to blame, or they've said that we're not to blame. Whatever that however that sort of transpires, and investigate the accident not in terms of trying to apportion blame, but in order to learn lessons and try to prevent what we can do to prevent a reoccurrence. Again, it comes back to the previous point I made there about messaging. We've got to start using different language in the way we investigate accidents. And blame is a very it's a very subjective word, isn't it? So try not to go down that path. Let's try to look at an accident from a slightly different perspective. Where did the system go wrong? Where did it all go pear-shaped that we've ended up in that situation? So thorough investigation of accidents. Try to move it in with that positive message and try to change the language of accidents. As I say, not a sales pitch, but we do a really good accident investigation for managers course as well, which I really make a thing of in that course. We really sort of emphasise that messaging. Okay, so wrap it up then with number 6, because Pete will say, I'll give you the blooming podcast to do, and look, you've gone on for 24 minutes, and what only wanted you to do a quick 5 minutes. So wrap it up then with number 6 then in true half a dozen things fashion, and it's rather sad to end it on this note, but also, and I guess you could kind of work this into your policy really. So we could top and tail this by sort of saying this would be a part of your policy. Also have something in your arsenal, in your armory to deal with the worst case scenario. So get a phone call from your driver or from police officers, road policing you, sergeant, whatever, and they tell you one of your vehicles is involved in a very serious road traffic collision. Have a plan in place to deal with that. We all think we don't want it to happen, and if we've taken the steps 1 to 5, then hopefully it won't happen because we've tried to prevent it happening. But if it does happen, have a plan in place to deal with it. We've got to think of as with our managers' hats on, we've got to think of number 1. We've got to think of our vehicle and the impact, what that's going to do. Is that vehicle going to be impounded? What's the situation with the vehicle? The vehicle might be carrying goods. At the end of the day, somebody's going to be inconvenienced by not getting their goods on time, or someone might have lost their life. So we have to put that into perspective. But we do have to think about that nonetheless. Think about now, I think the most important thing is support for the driver. What kind of support is in place for the driver? Now, at this point in time, as I say, we're not going to start sort of trying to point fingers and that kind of thing. We've got a person who didn't, whatever the circumstances, and it later might transpire that person has to face criminal charges for their actions that day. So, but at this point, we don't know, do we? Innocent until proven guilty, and we've got to give the support to that person. So, how would we deal with that? What are we going to do in terms of support for that particular driver? Get them back to their base, get them back to their home. The last thing you really want to do with that driver is, even if the vehicle transpires to be fine, is that driver in a fit and proper state to get back behind the wheel and drive? I doubt it very much, to be fair. And if your driver gets back to base, how are we going to deal with it? What actions are we going to take? What are you going to do? Do we suspend that driver? On what grounds? Do we let that driver continue to drive? There's no easy answer to this, but we need a plan, and we need to have something. We need to be thinking about how we're going to deal with that scenario. So support your drivers, and the other thing is let them know that there is that support network in place, that you're not going to leave them at the side of the road on a curb, or in handcuffs down the local nick. Whatever the outcome, at that point they are still your duty of care really as their employers to look after that driver's situation, or to support that driver as best you can. So there we are then. That's my 6, and that's vulnerable road users. For me, as I say, a very massively important topic. As I said, I've seen the impact that this can have on not only on the victims, but on the drivers as well, and it destroys morale in the whole, sort of operation. It takes a while to get. Again, I've no idea where this data come from, where this information come from, but I think it has been suggested to me in the past that 2 years is about right from a fatal road traffic collision involving one of your vehicles to it being, the best one in the world, yesterday's news. So it will have that effect on the business for that long. So, let's do what we can to prevent it. So identify your risks, and then from that, you'll be able to formulate a policy, a vulnerable road users policy. Training, I'm always going to say that, aren't I? Training, absolutely vital, coming in at number 3. Although you could run this 1 to 6, really, couldn't you? Awareness for the drivers, awareness of vulnerable road users, the awareness their legal, moral, and financial responsibilities that they carry around with them. Massive. Who says it's an easy job? It isn't. Positive messaging. Try to change your messaging to a more positive, in a more positive way, and avoid those horror movies. Instant investigation, really important, because it's not about pointing fingers, not about blame. That will come, but it's about trying to establish what happened. And as with most of these things, it's never just a single factor. There is always more than one. Even I would argue that root causes. There's always more than one root cause if you looked at it. Investigate the accident properly. Try to learn lessons from it. Try to put change policy, change vehicle specific, whatever it takes to prevent something like that happening again. And then last but by no means least, support your drivers. Okay, so I'm going to wrap it up there. Thank you very much indeed, and thanks for Pete for giving me the keys to the machine that is half a dozen things for this episode, and I look forward to seeing you all on the next one if he ever lets me loose on this again. Thank you very much indeed.
I really hope you loved today's episode, and if you did, please make sure you subscribe and listen out for future episodes too. Please do share it across your social media channels. We hope to reach more and help more people. If you want to find out more about me, my name's Pete Rushmer. You'll find me across any social media channel and my business, Flagship Partners, and we're your partners in success across your business. Thank you. See you again soon.